I actually came around here yesterday, but it was raining so much and there was so much wind, I had to abort and go back home. Sometimes you want to remove the engine and the gearbox as one unit. This is an idea that was inspired by my good friend Lee Booth, a guy called, his surname's Thacker, which is going to involve a bit more butchery, but it's always fun cutting into a mint Mk2 Escort shell. Bit of a mess, this mess. It's mad to think that I genuinely thought that this job was only going to take a few hours, and I've been on it for days. Once I decided to scrap the idea of keeping Heidi as a standard-ish daily driver and turn her into a drift toy as well as a daily, much like I did years ago with Maud, I knew that there was a few things that I didn't get round to doing to Maud that I wanted to do to Heidi, to make her into a better version of a drift car slash daily driver. In the last video that I filmed round here at the garage, I installed a large gearbox tunnel into Heidi, which is going to make any future gearbox removal a lot easier on Heidi than it has been in the past with Maud. And in this video, I want to make some more changes to Heidi, this time in her engine bay, to continue with the theme of turning Heidi into a way better drift toy slash daily than Maud ever was. If you're a regular viewer of my content, click the like button now because it's a massive help. Alternatively, if you're new to the channel, click subscribe now and welcome. I'm Marcus Hayes, and today we're going to be doing some more bodywork changes to Heidi, which is going to involve a bit more butchery, but it's always fun cutting into a mint Mk2 Escort shell. Now, the weather's been very unpredictable the last couple of days, which is why I'm going to crack on for the time being with Heidi inside the garage. I actually came around here yesterday with the intention of working on Heidi inside the garage, but it was raining so much and there was so much wind that I and Heidi were still getting absolutely soaked working on her with her in the garage. So I had to abort and go back home, and I've come back around here today to hopefully actually make some progress. Now, this engine bay is very dirty, very dusty. You can see it all collecting on the chassis legs, but we're going to be making a lot more mess, so there's no point clearing it up at the moment. As you can see, I've moved a few bits out of my way. The brake pipes that were still fitted to the engine bay are actually up on the roof, along with a couple of bits we're going to be adding to this body shell. I've also moved the wiring loom out the way as much as I can, but before we start welding new bits in, I actually want to crack on with removing something that's already welded in. Let me explain. Now that Heidi's got a huge gearbox tunnel, it means that if I ever want to remove the gearbox but keep the engine fitted, I can do that a lot easier. But sometimes you want to remove the engine and the gearbox as one unit. And one thing that's going to make that a bit easier is if I make this slam panel removable. This is an idea that was inspired by my good friend Lee Booth, who has done something similar with his 100E that he's building. So his bodywork up here is removable. He's also done a similar thing with the sort of structural stuff at the bottom, which I'm not going to be doing. But in terms of Mk2 Escorts, I've also seen a guy called, his surname's Thacker. He actually gave me very kindly the front spoiler that is currently fitted to Maud, which will probably be fitted to Heidi. But yeah, I've seen on his Mk2 Escort that he had the slam panel removable and bolt in, and yeah, I just think it's going to make life easier, as I say, when you want to remove the gearbox and the engine as one unit. Now, my thoughts on this are that I'm gonna, you know, just crack on and make it up as I go along, like I do with most jobs. But essentially, I'm going to need to carefully remove this sealer, and yeah, usually this would be spot welded. I can actually see some spot welds there. I'm sure I remember seeing some tacks on this. Not sure if this is the original slam panel, but essentially I need to remove this sealer carefully, possibly get rid of any tacks that are under there, and possibly drill out the spot welds here. I've noticed that there's spot welds along here where it meets to here, and yeah, it's just essentially a case of drilling out any spot welds and trying to get this thing off. And because I'm cheap, well, poor, I'm going to try and reuse Heidi's current slam panel. If I fail, then I'll just buy another one, paint it up, and yeah, we'll bolt that one on. But I think even if I do end up scrapping this slam panel, it's still going to be beneficial to try and remove it as carefully as I can to not do any unnecessary damage to the areas where it's spot welded to, like the inner wings, etc. One thing that's definitely going to go is this strengthening piece down here. In fact, I'm going to be cutting off this bit of it as well. So that should make this job easier, because I can literally hack that off there, and yeah, I can hack that off, you know, make it look as neat as I can across there. So that's going to mean that I don't need to remove these spot welds. Over here, I'm probably going to end up cutting this bit off of the slam panel, or cut off the bit of this bit that this bit's attached to, if that makes any sense. Because I feel like if these are going to be sort of overlapping each other but not welded together, then they're just going to vibrate against each other, and I don't want that. However, I'm still going to try to drill out the spot welds rather than just hacking into it with a cutting disc. Because yeah, I'd rather get the slam panel off and then decide, you know, what bits I'm going to trim down from the car or from the slam panel. And yeah, see where I'm at. I removed Heidi's wings to get them out of the way, and then I started stripping back the seam sealer. I found a couple of tack welds, which I carefully cut with my angle grinder, and then I started digging out the MIG plugs at the front of the slam panel. And once I'd got the passenger side to the same state, the weather improved. So I pulled Heidi out of her garage. I grabbed my Sharpie and marked a few points on the front panel that I was going to cut, and then attacked those marks with my angle grinder. This would basically keep the top of the front panel attached to the slam panel, which would save me drilling out the spot welds all along here. I started drilling out the spot welds on the top of the inner wing, and I tried to drill out the MIG plugs from the front, which was a bit of a nightmare. But eventually, after some more drilling and some chiseling, the passenger side of the slam panel was free. Then I just had to repeat the process along the rest of the panel, and then I was able to pull the slam panel free from the car. So now I just need to make it bolt on. Alright, slam panel is off, and I was expecting to see a bit of a mess behind it, and yeah, it is a bit of a mess, but definitely no worse than I was expecting. This side looks a bit more pitted. This has had work in the past. You can see welds along there, and yeah, this side looks like it's had a sort of whole square section put in there. And yeah, it's a really time-consuming job, drilling out spot welds and stuff. I should really have a proper spot weld drill bit, which I don't. But the main bit that was difficult, particularly on this side, was at the front here, where the slam panel was actually MIG plugged onto this piece, because this piece here was replaced at some point. And yeah, when I was struggling with this, I was basically thinking that I weren't going to be able to save this slam panel. But I think I will be able to, and the reason I'd rather save the slam panel is because then I can keep all of this bit, which is essentially the top of the front panel. Yeah, I can keep that attached to the slam panel, so this piece is a lot more strong. So yeah, I think I'll be able to save this. Definitely going to have to weld in some metal to repair these bits, try and weld in some metal to fill these holes in. But I do reckon if I spend enough time, I should just about be able to repair this and reuse it, which will save me about 75 quid, because I won't have to buy another slam panel. Now, these bits here, I'm definitely going to trim down to just below those holes. Gets rid of all this surface rust, and it means I don't have to worry about filling those holes. Yeah, same the other side. As I mentioned, that's going to mean then that this bit of metal isn't vibrating against the other bit of metal when the slam panels bolt in. I will be keeping this bit here though, which I'll be able to bolt to, well, I'll be able to bolt this bit of the slam panel to it. Most of this will be cut out to fit the alloy rad, which is currently fitted to Maud, but will be fitted to Heidi. But yeah, I'll keep this bit just so that yeah, it can bolt to these, and then these aren't as flimsy. This is obviously where the radiator bolts to. So yeah, with that tied into the slam panel, this isn't going to move around. With some of this cut away, it's not going to vibrate against the slam panel. And then with this bit bolted to the slam panel, it's going to make these bits a bit more rigid. So yeah, I think that's the plan there. As I mentioned earlier, this is going to get hacked off lower, and I'll be removing this bit completely. May end up making this into a different shape, definitely tidying it up a little bit at least. But yeah, I think for the rest of this video, I'm going to forget the other bits that I was planning to weld into Heidi's engine bay and just focus on finishing these bits off. I'm going to weld in some new metal, I think. I'll probably cut out most of this and yeah, just put a patch both sides. I'm not going to try and butt weld it. I'm just going to overlap it. I really don't mind putting a little bit of filler, you know, between where it overlaps and this swage line. So, you know, I'll clean this metal up and I'll definitely leave at least a little bit of an overlap. And yeah, just weld a plate in and make sure that it's welded to this piece as well, at least with a couple of tacks. This will obviously need straightening up. This side's even worse. So yeah, I'll cut out the worst of the rot, make up a plate to go over the top, and yeah, that'll finish that bit off nicely, and it gets rid of all these holes which I otherwise would have had to try to MIG plug up anyway. So yeah, I'll pull Heidi back out the garage because it looks like it's brightened up again. Who knows how long that will last, but the welder's behind Heidi anyway. And yeah, start trying to fabricate some new bits. I started by using my persuader and my pliers to straighten up the lips at the front. Then I used my angle grinder to clean up the rusty bits as best as I could, so that I could then see exactly how much I was going to need to cut out. I made some templates which I could then transfer onto a sheet of steel, and once they were marked up and cut out and bashed about a bit so that they curved round the inner wing here and here, the plates were looking pretty good. Into a new day, and it was time to cut the rusty bits out of the top of the inner wings. And then I cleaned up the bare metal areas with a wire brush on a drill. Next, I grabbed the weld through primer from my friends at BODICRAFT in Watford and sprayed the bare metal areas on top of the inner wings. Whilst that was drying, I drilled a load of holes in my plates that I'd made so that I could MIG plug them onto the car. And once those were weld through primed, they were ready to weld in. I also cut out and weld through primed these little bits to strengthen the radiator supports. I decided to switch to a 0.8mm wire on my MIG welder to replace the 0.6mm one, and it turned out that the wheel on the feed wasn't suited to the 0.6 anyway. I noticed straight away that the welds were coming out better than before, even though they were obviously a lot bigger. It just seemed like I was breezing through this welding job, and I was actually enjoying it. The bigger welds obviously took a bit more grinding down, but that was absolutely fine. And once I'd done that, I decided to knife edge the edge of the plate to make the filler work easier later on. I put an 80 grit DA disc from my friends at Kent Europe on my DA sander to smooth the plate out a bit, and then to further prep the area for filler, I removed some of the paint from around the plate. I repeated these processes for the other welded areas, then I trimmed off the excess from the front of the inner wings. Then I set about removing the rest of the central brace, before using a grinder to tidy things up a bit. Although this area won't be seen when the grill's fitted anyway. But yeah, there it is. Some rust deleted and some plates grafted in. Alright, welding is done, and I've got to say I am so impressed with how well the welder works when I'm using the 0.8mm wire. So yeah, definitely going to be using 0.8mm wire in future, unless I end up welding something really thin. But yeah, just seemed more difficult with the 0.6mm wire, and I feel like with the 0.8mm wire you're going to waste less gas as well, whereas before you're having to sort of build up the welds. With the 0.8mm wire, the welds naturally come out bigger, which means less trigger time, which hopefully means less gas. But yeah, that is the welding done. Obviously going to need to do some filler work to sort of smooth this out a bit. I'm going to try and keep it really local and just go up to the little kink that's around here. Doesn't have to be absolutely perfect at all. By the time the slam panel's bolted on, it will take your eye off it anyway. I'll add that to the endless list of filler work that I've still got to do on this body shell, because before I crack on with any of that filler work, I think I should try and get the slam panel repaired and actually make the slam panel bolt on. Now, obviously where this sits, the inner wing is now slightly higher because I've overlapped the metal, but it's not going to be a big deal at all. It'll be absolutely fine. This bit might need to be bent down a bit so that meets, but you know, when you bolt it all up, it'll be absolutely fine. But yeah, I need to address this mess. Now, I think what I'm actually going to do, once I've straightened this out as best as I can, is I'm just going to weld a square piece of plate underneath this, and I can just weld it using the holes that I've had to drill to get the spot welds out. So essentially I'll MIG plug it up using these holes. I think that's going to be the easiest way, rather than sort of trying to add individual strips. This bit here, this hole is by design, and these holes were spot welds. I think I'm actually just going to cut this out so that it's a square, then I don't have to worry about MIG plugging up these two holes. And this area here is actually where the bonnet pins are going to need to be. So yeah, just making that a big square isn't going to be a massive deal at all, especially when you're going to have like a whole plate on the bottom of it, which is going to add way more strength than this thing ever had. This side is definitely the worst, but yeah, as I say, essentially just got to slap a plate on both sides. I think that's going to be the quickest and easiest way, and then we can actually see about getting this thing bolted on. I used my persuader and these wide-jawed mole grips to straighten out the ends of the slam panel as best as I could. Then I cleaned up the rust underneath the slam panel and cut the squares out where the bonnet pins are going to be, as I mentioned earlier. I removed the rest of the central brace and cleaned the rust up behind that. Then I cleaned up another couple of scabby bits and trimmed off the excess bits that I wanted to remove. I actually think I would have been better off not cutting this square out and using those holes that were for the spot welds to MIG plug this to the plate that I'm going to make, but it's a bit late now. Yeah, hindsight is a wonderful thing. It was time to make the plates to weld onto the ends, and once they were cut out and weld through primed, they were ready. I purposely made them a bit oversized, and I can trim that down later. I MIG plugged the plates on using the holes that were left from drilling out the spot welds, and then into a new day, I ground down the welds, which was a bit difficult because I was doing it in between the showers. Good old English weather. When the rain died down a bit, I cut the excess off of my plates and then cleaned up the welds with a wire brush on a drill. With the slam panel laid in place, I worked out where I was going to put my bolt holes. Then, once they were drilled, I could lay the slam panel back in place and mark where the holes were going to be on the inner wings. I planned to use M6 riv nuts to bolt the slam panel on, which require a 9mm hole. But once I drilled the holes, I remembered I don't have an M6 mandrel, but I had a plan B. So I drilled out the passenger side inner wing, then cleaned up the metal on the underside around those holes, and then nut and bolted the slam panel on. I then welded the nuts to the underside of the inner wings, and voila, my first ever DIY captive nuts. Whilst the welder was out, I repaired the slam panel near where the radiator supports were, using a bit of copper held behind. I left this hole, which was going to be one of my bolt holes, and this one, which is a ground connection. Then I did the necessary grinding and drilling to set myself up for some captive nuts here. And with the slam panel removed, I could then weld those captive nuts on. And I cut a little bit out of the driver's side radiator support to make space for the captive nut for the ground point. I waved my angle grinder at the slam panel to grind down all the other welds, and then I cleaned up the bare metal areas on the inner wings and the slam panel with the wire brush on the drill. I grabbed the Kent Europe Ultra Multi-Fiber, which is like a filler mixed with fiberglass, and applied it to the areas on the inner wings. I then poked bolts through my captive nuts the wrong way to clear the threads of the filler. Then I applied the filler to the slam panel, and then it was time to start sanding everything down. It got dark whilst I was sanding down the inner wings, but the next day, which was thankfully a sunny one, I sanded down the filler on the slam panel as well. And at this point, things were really starting to take shape. I blew all the dust out of Heidi's engine bay and then threw some masking tape about. I grabbed a 320 sanding disc and smoothed out the filler and keyed up the beige paint around the filler patches. Then, after a quick clean with some Aquasol, it was time to chuck on the epoxy primer. I used a bit of cardboard to make sure I didn't get any overspray anywhere I didn't want it, and the slam panel on both sides got a coat of epoxy primer as well. Whilst the primer was drying, I chipped off all the loose undersill from under the inner wings and then coated them with epoxy primer. And then once the slam panel was dry, I shot a thumbnail and then bolted the slam panel onto the car properly for the first time. It was looking good, but there was still work to do. I grabbed the Kent Europe sealer and applied it around the edges of my repairs underneath the inner wings. And once that was dry, I gave the areas a coat of the Kent rubber guard, which finished them off nicely. And there we have it. We finally have a bolt-on slam panel for Heidi. What a mission. It's mad to think that I genuinely thought that this job was only going to take a few hours, and I've been on it for days. But the poor weather that we've been having here in England recently did play a big part in that. Thankfully, the weather is really good today. And I've now somewhat finished this job of making the slam panel removable or quick release. There's still a load of body work to do. You know, this has only had one skim of the ultra multi-fiber filler, so gonna have to give the slam panel and this area a skim of the normal filler and sand that down. But for one skim, it's actually looking pretty decent. This area here, I'll probably just put seam sealer in when the time comes. I will be making a hole in this plate that I've put in, just so that I've got room for the bonnet pin to poke through, which will be attached to the inner wing rather than the slam panel. But yeah, the slam panel, I'm actually considering just bare metaling the rest of it with wire brushes, because by the time I smooth out all these edges that I've created and, you know, key up everything that hasn't been hit, and yeah, it might be just as quick to bare metal the whole thing again with wire brushes on a drill. But I'll obviously stay away from the areas that I've already put filler on. But yeah, absolutely loving the fact that Heidi's now got a bolt-in slam panel. I mean, if we crouch down here and you imagine if you was putting an engine and gearbox into the car, you know, how much of a shallow angle you can just put the engine and gearbox in like this, rather than having to go up and, you know, angle the gearbox down and then back up again. Yeah, this is going to make a massive difference in terms of making this car easier to work on. You know, this slam panel I can probably remove in 1 minute with the gun. 1 minute to remove it at the beginning of an engine removal job, another minute to refit it at the end of an engine refitting job. And yeah, that couple of minutes is going to save me hours and hours and hours on the job of, you know, removing an engine and refitting it, in my opinion. Now, I may actually end up using Allen key bolts rather than these hex bolts. I'll certainly be using shorter bolts than these, but yeah, these were actually handy for me to be able to mask up whilst I did the rubber guarding and stuff, because if you get gear on the threads, then when you try and pull the bolts back out, it's going to put all that gear into the threads of the captive nuts that I've welded onto the bottom. Now, it's worth noting that you could go further than I have with this, and I think Ben Thacker has gone further in this way, and that would be to actually remove these radiator support bits. You know, with these out of the way, you've got all this extra space when it comes to removing and refitting engines. You know, that might be the difference between you having to remove your alternator, say, from your engine. Now, in the future, I may end up removing the radiator supports and, you know, taking this a step further, but that would, of course, require me to figure out a different way to mount the radiator. I think a lot of the Japanese cars, the bottom of the radiators just sort of slot into holes at the bottom, and then the top of the radiator has like a bracket from the slam panel to the radiator. So yeah, if you was to remove these bits, then you could mount the radiator in a similar way to the Jap cars do. But I do think what I've done here is already going to make things a million times easier. And yeah, a really worthwhile modification in my opinion. So yeah, do let me know what you think of my quick release slam panel. I can already hear the haters telling me I've compromised the strength of the shell. It's a Mk2 Escort. If you crash it hard, you're gonna die anyway. So I don't think it's gonna matter. The same with the bolt-on wings, you know, it just makes things a bit better in terms of working on the car. And I don't think you're gonna die any less in a high-speed crash by having these bits bolt on rather than spot welded on. Now the next time that I'm round here working on Heidi, I'm going to be cracking on with welding in the bits that I plan to do in this video when I assumed that this job was only going to take me a few hours. I've also got some bits to show you that were very kindly sent to me by a couple of subscribers, and I'm going to be revisiting something that I did on this car recently following some advice from you guys. So until then, do give this video a thumbs up if you thought it was any good. If you didn't, give it a thumbs down. Click subscribe if you're new. Check the links in the description to follow me on social media. My email address will be down there as usual for anyone who wants to contact me. I'll leave links to my own website and the Petrolhead Style website in the description. Definitely go and check out both of those. Huge thanks as always to my patrons for your ongoing support. But other than that, until next time, thanks for watching.